At the beginning of the year, I made a simple guitar to bass conversion video with individual saddles that could either be loaded at the top with strings or strung through the body. Eventually trying out both options in other experiments, I now had 6 spots to hold strings. And the 3 machine head holes left unfilled on the headstock were begging for an idea a lot of you guys had already pointed out back in the original build video. Of course, guitars with 6 strings don't turn any heads, and even 6-string basses are fairly well known, but this is a totally different breed. I'll put previous video links in the description if you want to start from the beginning, but this next step has a lot to talk about alone. As always, I've got the timestamp right here if you want to just skip to the demo already. This is Kevin from Said Too Much. Now I knew 8-string chorus basses already existed, so I started there for any parts I could use. But it looked like any hardware commercially available were all one fixed 4-saddle bridge, so I was puzzled for a while about how to pull this off. Then I remembered I have a 3D printer, and only really need one specific new component to accommodate 2 strings instead of 1. Using a high infill setting to make sure it's dense enough for some good sustain, the prints weren't the prettiest, but worked. So fitting the thick bass strings at the top and some modified guitar strings through the bottom, it all seemed pretty good. Until tuning it up to find the intonation was horrible and the tuning seemed to keep going flat, especially on those octave strings. As for the intonation issue, I already knew that both strings on one saddle probably needed their own individual movements, just like some other 12-string guitar bridges I've seen. But when I looked into 8-string chorus basses, they all had this same idea coming off at the same point. If any of you out there have some actual experience with these 8-string chorus basses, please feel free to fill us in the comments. Right now I'm just kinda confused and I don't really have the ability to redesign quite right now. Of course, just pushing the saddles back as far as I could generally solve this problem, but that's when the detuning issue came in. The original component had a little hex screw to hold it in place. I thought the downward pressure of the strings would hold it down well enough, but when pushing these through body strings closer to the exit hole, we get an apparently significant forward force as it tries to straighten itself out, thus constantly detuning both. However, being more substantial on those higher strings, because the distance of movement took up more of a percentage of those smaller wavelengths. So to help, I made some shims and friction-full surfaces using electrical tape. Kinda like what the original hex screws were doing, which is about the best I can do right now. It seemed pretty straightforward to just fit those original guitar machine heads back into the empty holes, but they didn't quite fit in between the bigger bass machine heads, at least in the traditional perpendicular to the headstock fashion. Luckily, with some rearranging of where the mounting holes would line up in a new configuration, I got them in a more parallel to the nut look, which I still think is aesthetically appealing. They're all able to freely turn without bumping into each other, but it is still a little uncomfortable trying to get your fingers in there sometimes. Fitting the octave strings under the same huge bass string trees, I'm satisfied on this end. Now ideally I would have recut a new blank nut, but reordering what I thought I had bought before, an easy to use graphite block, I was shipped this thin pre-radius plastic one. So I decided to try and just slide the existing one over a little, and after making some initial cuts for the new strings and giving them all some decent tension, it practically moved itself over to the appropriate position. The problem now was that the low E's octave string slips off that thin ledge it's been left with. So I cut the excess off the other side and superglued it to that gap. Crude, I know, but hey, all my projects are more like prototyping anyway. Cutting all the slots now to an appropriate depth, we're done. So what do you guys think? Does this build have some actual use? Or should I have just saved up and bought a normal 8-string chorused bass? If you took the time to check out some of those previous video links in the description, or maybe you're gonna check them out after this video, you should have seen me experimenting with some alternative string ideas using the secret piezo pickup I installed back in the original video that uses pressure changes to create an electrical signal. My actual first idea for this project was using nylon acoustic guitar strings as the octave ones. This would allow me to hear all the strings on the piezo, but solo the bass strings switching to a magnetic pickup, since the nylon is a non-ferromagnetic material and wouldn't create an electrical signal in their magnetic field. I quickly learned, however, that the thicker, denser, tighter strings of the bass overpowered anything else coming through that piezo. Having switched on the fly to a more straightforward chorus project, I'm sure there are plenty of ideas and solutions we can try from here, so be sure to comment below, or check the description again for any updates there might be already. Maybe a third alternative strings video is warranted. For now though, enough said. For early video access, raw instrument tracks, and more exclusives, find our community on Patreon and consider adding your support.
Said too much.